If God is so important to our lives, then why does he seem to be hidden? That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. All right, welcome back, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate you doing that. And so those of you who follow this channel religiously, you may be expecting an episode today on storytelling in Hollywood, specifically what I've coined Hollywood taxidermy, right? Where you take IP that is alive and you kill it and you skin it and you stuff it with whatever you want, right? Your own characters, your own story, your own ideology. So I talked a bit about that last time in the previous episode where I explored the Netflix Mary movie. Whew, that's a hoot. That episode. If you want to delve into that and see me let my hair down, right, so to speak, and give some candid response to that film. And I will be, in terms of talking about this problem of Hollywood taxidermy, I will be talking about that, the ethics of that, in an upcoming episode. But hey, I wanted to talk about something else today, and specifically divine hiddenness. That's been a topic that's been in the queue, and I've noticed from the comments, yes, we do look at the comments. We do pay attention to what you folks out there like and want. I know that I'm not the only one who wanted that in the queue. Other folks wanted me to weigh in on the problem of divine hiddenness, so today is the day. I've brought up the problem of hiddenness specifically in the context of the nuns or the religiously unaffiliated. So folks who have, who are familiar with my work before and outside of the Nathan Jacobs Podcast are familiar with the fact that I did a bunch of research on the nuns. Now, this is not Catholic Orthodox nuns, right? This is N-O-N-E-S, as in none of the above, the religiously unaffiliated. So this terrible term comes out of, it's only terrible because like you always have to do this spiel trying to clarify what the term does and doesn't mean because everybody thinks you're talking about Catholic nuns. But nuns refers to those with no religion, right? So this comes out of religion surveys where none of the above is the last item listed. And so when there was a spike in religious dissociation in America, they came up with a term for this group, which had grown from like 5% to like 15%, seemingly overnight. So they needed a term and they were like, oh, nuns, because like none of the above, that would be very clever. Yeah, they didn't think through the ramifications of the amount of explanation and confusion that would be required by that term. I mean, they're sociologists. They're not marketing people. But anyway, that's the term we're stuck with. So I spent a good deal of time focusing on the religiously unaffiliated. I did a documentary called Becoming Truly Human, where I spoke with this demographic. Anyway, I won't belabor that whole thing. But I did a documentary on them. I've done multiple lectures on them, talks at different conferences and things like that, having to do with the patterns of belief of the religiously unaffiliated. I came out of that world. So it's both a product of my own study and my own journey. And so anyway, I have quite a bit to say about the nuns. And we have done a couple of episodes here. So I think you can dig around. We can probably link to it down below. To a couple of episodes, one where I talk about contours of belief amongst the religiously unaffiliated, and then the other one that we did about the evolution of a nun, where I talk about sort of the stages that people go through moving from, association to dissociation, and then ultimately back again for many of them, folks like myself. So anyway, if you're interested in that topic, you can dig into those episodes. I'm not here to talk about the nuns, but the thing that comes up oftentimes with the nuns is that many of them, when you talk about, well, why, right? Why did you move away from religion in the first place? What was the thing that like shook your belief, shook your faith? And truthfully, they will oftentimes go semi-academic with this. They'll bring up the problem of evil or something like that, talk about problem of evil, problem of suffering, things like that. But the fact of the matter is that when you listen to them, what they describe in terms of when they move away from the the formulation, right? Well, if there's an all good God, then how could he allow evil? And they go into this sort of like academic abstraction. When they get into what the actual events were in their life, you find that more often than not, they're actually describing something closer to the problem of divine hiddenness. Now, that's no surprise, right? I mean, they're not trained philosophers. Most of the nuns are not trained philosophers. So, it's expected that they don't know that there's a difference between, say, the problem of pain and the problem of evil, or the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. So that's fine. It's not a criticism of them. It's just to say that most folks, when they talk about what's going on in their lives, let's take for an example, right? My parents were fighting and struggling, thinking of one particular nun who gave this sort of account in my documentary. She was talking about how, like, her parents were going through a hard time in their marriage. They were struggling. They prayed in order to, in the hope that that God would sort of repair the marriage. And her parents ended up getting divorced. And so it was this like, there must be no God listening. Now, what's interesting there was it wasn't the fact that mom and dad were struggling, evil, right? Something like that. It wasn't suffering. It wasn't evil that threw her into crisis. It's that God didn't answer, right? And so and this is oftentimes the case, is that what people are really describing, it's not that an evil event always sets them on their heels. Sometimes it is that, right? There's some sort of evil that's so catastrophic and so devastating, they just can't believe that there would be a being who would be observing this and wouldn't step in and stop it, right? Like, that does happen. That's true. But more often than not, what's being described is something closer to hiddenness, where it's like, why didn't God answer? So it's not the evil that sets them on their heels in their faith. It's that when they turn to God in the midst of that evil, in the midst of that crisis or whatever it is, and God seems to be absent, that absence, that palpable absence, is the thing that sets them back on their heels. And that moves closer to something like this problem of divine hiddenness. If God is real, if he's there, if he's watching, if he's so important to my life, then why does he seem to be so absent? Right. And so this is the problem that we want to look at today. Now, the existential sort of man on the street version is exactly what I just described. I'm in some sort of crisis. I'm in some sort of challenge. I cry out for God, and it seems like I'm just shouting at the walls, right? And that's sort of the version of it that most people experience. And I want to talk about that because even though when I start down this road, here's just to give you a preview of where we're going. I'm going to offer the sort of analytic formulation from somebody like Schellenberg of this problem, right? And I'll go through like what's problematic about that. But here's the challenge. Oftentimes, and this is something that I think people feel regularly, when it comes to a sort of analytic way of dealing with an existential problem, it leaves them cold. So let me give you two examples, right? The one example is that sometimes when folks are like, well, does God exist? And they're not asking from crisis, right? They're really wanting, like, they want you to convince them. The nuns did this all the time, by the way. Whenever it was always interesting that the nuns would talk about, most of them are not atheists. They believe the world is spiritual. And you could tell they would be like, I would love to believe in God, or, I'd believe in God if I had proof or something like that. But whenever I'd press them on what they meant by proof, they didn't really know what they meant by proof. And what's interesting is it was obvious from talking to them, they weren't looking for something like the cosmological argument or the ontological argument or something like that. And if I walked them through that, it's unlikely that they would be like, oh, you're right, I now believe, because there was something else going on. It wasn't raw analysis that led them to not believe in God. It was something more experiential, something more existential. And that something is the problem of divine hiddenness. And so oftentimes what'll happen is in analytic theology, or analytic philosophy, sometimes people will walk through and they'll show why there's a series of presumptions or premises that are problematic, and they'll sort of dismantle a problem. Do this with the problem of evil oftentimes, right? Here's all the premises, and now we're going to dig in and we're going to show why those premises are problematic, why the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise, or there's certain presumptions in here that are problematic or whatever. But yet, the person who is really honestly asking that problem, right, who is really struggling with the reality of evil, it leaves them cold. And why does it leave them cold? Well, it leaves them cold because you're addressing two different things, right? There's something that has happened, let's say, in the heart, right? Something in experience that has left them in a place of, palpable struggle, wondering really where God is, or wondering how it's possible that a good God could ever allow somebody to experience what they're experiencing, or something like that. There is an existential component of it, and it's not raw analysis, right? It's not a computational problem that they're dealing with, and so a computational response really leaves them cold. It doesn't address the thing. It's like you're talking to, it's as if, we might think analogically, it's as if something has gone wrong in the ear and you're sitting there, analyzing their eyes or something like that. And that's really sort of the disconnect. Now, the reason I bring that up is because the problem of divine hiddenness has the same sort of character, where folks will point out, and I'll go ahead and do this, right? They'll point out the sort of analytic problems with a case from somebody like Schellenberg, and they'll try to address that. But the fact of the matter is, that still sort of leaves them feeling like, I guess that addresses the problem, but I still don't feel it. Now, the sort of modernist analytic rationalist might be, inclined to say, well, that's just because you're an irrational person. I don't think that's the case. I think it's because anthropologically, we are more than just a mind, right? And so the issue is really that, that what has prompted this problem is not a sheer problem of analysis. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge the existential side of these problems. And I want to do that. So this is where I'm sympathetic. I'm very sympathetic to the problem of divine hiddenness. I know from personal experience what it's like to be in the thick of crisis and to cry out to God with tears and want God to answer and to feel like I'm shouting at the walls. Yeah, I know what that's like. And I think it's important when dealing with these problems that we're honest about that. And so I do want to address the analytic side, because I don't think the questions of reason, right, the analysis is irrelevant. I just don't think it's the whole story. And so with that, let's start with the sort of typical analytic approach, right? The formal, presentation of hiddenness from somebody like Schellenberg, the types of analytic problems that can be, shown with that argument, why it seems to fall apart. But let's also then after that, I want to move into some of these other areas where I think some of these more analytic responses are, deficient, that something more is needed. And I'll offer what I think is the something more. So with that, let's jump into it. Okay, so the problem of divine hiddenness, as like formally structured by somebody like Schellenberg, would be basically saying something along the lines of, if there is a God, then this God would be all-loving. If there is an all-loving God, then he would not permit such a thing as rational unbelief. There is rational unbelief, and therefore there's, not a God. So the argument is formulated pretty similar to, something like the problem of evil, where you try to say, well, if we grant the traditional classical divine attributes of an optimal being, that he's omnipotent and he's omnibenevolent, then evil shouldn't exist. Evil exists, therefore, right? So it's a pretty straightforward formulation. Now, there are a host of presumptions within this argument, and I'm not unique in pointing this out. Other folks who have dealt with this problem, people like Paul Moser, have highlighted these as well. But let's just point out a few of them. One is the presumption that there is such a thing as rational unbelief, meaning somebody who has looked at the evidence and given an honest accounting of the evidence and come to the conclusion that there is no God. That's one thing. The second presumption is that were there sufficient evidence that a person would believe, right? This is sort of an anthropological assumption that suggests that we as human beings, if we see sufficient evidence of a thing, we move ahead toward belief. And, also with this gets to sort of a third presumption of the argument, which is that belief and faith. It ends up conflating belief and faith. So when talking about this sort of thing, there is this presumption that if I were presented sufficient evidence, I would believe the evidence, and therefore I would adjust my life accordingly. Right. And again, that's a rather large presupposition. And then the other thing with this is it kind of presumes a whole bunch of things theologically, right? It presumes that belief is the basis for salvation and damnation. So it has sort of like a very sort of Protestant picture of soteriology, of salvation, right, of the Christian narrative and things like that. And it also presumes with that that there are folks who don't believe and ultimately will be damned, right? So all of these are presuppositions that sit there within the argument. And it's worth noting that these are presuppositions that are not necessarily obvious, right? These are vulnerable presuppositions. So when dealing with this problem, right, there's a couple of different ways to approach it, right? The one is from the negative side, right? You just sort of try to chip away at the various presuppositions and show that the presuppositions of the argument are problematic, and therefore the formulation fails, right? The conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. That's one of the ways you can approach it. The other way you can approach it is you can offer a positive accounting for hiddenness. So this is something that people tend to do, where they offer some sort of instrumental value, right, to God being hidden. And for that reason, they want to say that there's good reason why God's hidden. So it's not that it's unloving, it's actually a loving thing, or it's a good thing, or it's, let's say, a necessary thing for whatever reason. And so those tend to be the two tactics, right? The negative and positive. And we'll look at both here today. So let's start, with the negative ones, which is to basically go ahead and dig in on the presuppositions. Let's start with this whole notion that there is such a thing as rational unbelief. One of the things that I find very interesting is how casually people will just say, well, you can't prove the existence of God, right? I'll hear this all the time. When I would teach Intro to Philosophy, for example, I'd always hear students say that, right? Well, this would just be a premise. You can't prove the existence of God. And I would always ask, I'd be like, well, okay, that's interesting. You said you can't prove the existence of God. So can you tell me like why you think the proofs fail? And normally there'd be some sort of blank stare, like, what are you talking about, the proofs? And I'd always ask, well, are you aware that there are proofs for the existence of God, like formal, philosophical, analytic proofs for the existence of God? And usually the answer is like, no, they're not even aware of that. So if you're amongst those, right, who are unaware, there are proofs for the existence of God. So Thomas Aquinas is sort of famously catalogs a bunch of these within his Summa Theologica. And this is the sort of thing you see at the opening, right? He gives his 5 sort of proofs, but there's more than 5, right? This is just Aquinas going through some of the main ones that, he advocates, right? And so here you find things like the cosmological argument. He catalogs what's basically Aristotle's version of the cosmological argument, which is an argument for motion and mutation that suggests that, motion and mutation requires that it sits upon something that is unmoved, right? This is Aristotle's unmoved mover, that contingent and shifting realities need to rest upon something that doesn't shift and doesn't change. He offers what's basically the Kalam cosmological argument. So the Kalam cosmological argument is basically a different form of the cosmological argument, which suggests that, basically if the world has a beginning, right, there needs to be a start to motion. And so in order to set things in motion, so it's starting from a first cause in the sort of temporal sense. Aristotle's doesn't have that because Aristotle thinks the world is eternal. And so he doesn't think the world starts, right? His is a sort of a vertical first cause. All these shifting realities need to rest on something that doesn't shift. The Kalam, our cosmological argument, starts from a beginning to the cosmos. And so you have that argument, right? He has arguments from teleology, right? This idea of structure and meaning in the world. Anyway, so there are a variety of arguments that Aquinas goes through. And then there's other arguments like the ontological argument, right, for the existence of God, where you argue from the definition of God. This is something that emerges in Anselm. And there's two different formulations of it. And then it's been advocated by people like Alvin Plantinga in recent days, where it's been sort of reformulated again in an analytic sense, where they suggest if you understand what God is, an optimal being, you understand that he exists. And then on top of that, there's other arguments that exist that have emerged over the years for the existence of God, right? So these various proofs. So the first question is always just sort of like, well, are you aware? Have you actually done an accounting of the evidence? So if you're going to casually say, right, there actually is rational unbelief, the first question is, well, are you sure? Right? Have you done an accounting of the evidence in order to come to the conclusion to say the evidence fails? I've gone through all the proofs for the existence of God. I've analyzed all of them, and I've shown that they're all fallacious, or they're all problematic, that they all fall apart, or something like that. Now, one of the things that people will pivot to, if you point this out, is they go to a second major presumption of the argument, which is, well, if the proofs worked, then everybody would believe, right? And this is actually a rather massive presupposition about anthropology, which is that if we can be shown analytically that a certain thing, that the evidence supports a certain thing, that we would immediately concede the point. It's a really sort of a rationalist anthropology that suggests that somehow like humans are just computational machines who make choices based on analysis. That's pretty obviously and demonstrably false. First of all, I'll just say this. In general, the fact of the matter is that we as creatures, if you just go with an ancient anthropology, the fact that we are animal spirit hybrids, we have more than analysis at work, right? So first of all, just in the sense that we have a higher and lower animal nature, the fact of the matter is we have animal desires, and we all know what it's like to have our mind, right? Our analysis tell us that we should do a thing that's good, and then just do the other thing because it just feels better, right? Or it just seems to me more desirable. And in retrospect, we might look back and be like, yeah, that was just dumb. Like, I shouldn't have done that. We all know what that's like. So the idea that somehow reason always wins and we're just computational machines, just in the basic sense of we're animal rational hybrids, is pretty demonstrably false. But then when you open that up to other aspects of anthropology, you have further things that call that into question. Even if we're just going to stick with the sort of Western scholastic model, which does have a high view of the role of analysis and choice, you had people already like the voluntarists who were questioning this sort of thing. So somebody like Thomas Aquinas is an intellectualist. And I'm not going to go through the whole of like medieval faculty psychology, but suffice it to say that in the medieval era, the basic assumption about how we engage in decision making and things like that, there was an early dispute between what were called the intellectualists and the voluntarists. And the idea was that you have like sort of two different faculties: the faculty of will, which engages in choice, and the faculty of intellect, which engages in some sort of analysis, right, of the choices available to you, means and ends, right? And the intellectualists tended to think, well, the will is just sort of a blind follower of the intellect. So wherever the intellect lands on a topic, the will just has to follow. Whereas the voluntarists wanted to say, I don't think that's actually true. They didn't think it was true partially because they thought it would land in determinism, some sort of psychological determinism. And you can see the lengthy episode on free will where I discuss some of those details. But that was part of the reason. But they also thought it was just demonstrably false because of things like the fact that we oftentimes arrive at certain judgments and then don't do them. And so voluntarists thought, I think the will has a more sort of fluid, spontaneous character to it, where, it can sort of, push back on the intellect and redirect it and sort of engage in some sort of alternative paths of reasoning, either based on desires or based on the passions or, whatever it might be. And so the voluntarists introduced that. There's also been a lot of critique of this sort of anthropology also from the Eastern Orthodox side of things. I'm going to do a whole episode at some point here on just sort of the notion of the mystical and the nous and reason and faith and things like that in the Eastern patristic tradition. But for now, let me just say this. There is something that you find within the Eastern Fathers where there's a great deal of talk about the heart, right? Something that seems to have fallen out of Western anthropology. And then there's also this talk of nous, which on the one hand, yes, it encompasses things like reason and will, but for the Eastern Fathers, it's more than that. Okay. And this gets into what I think it's Vladimir Lossky who called it like their sort of deep ontology. In other words, meaning what they recognize is that there's this whole sort of wealth of ontology underneath you and I that we're not always even aware of, right? So this is sort of thing that modern psychology, of course, got into with the subconscious and things like that. But the Eastern Fathers already had that notion that there's a great deal of depth. There's the things that I'm immediately aware of about myself, but there's other things underneath there that I'm not immediately aware of. And this was actually a big part of why they would go into the desert. And the desert fathers would do things like be alone because they know once you take away all the distractions and you stick me in a desert and you take away all the different ways of self-medicating the rest, I'm going to start to see some stuff inside me that I didn't really know was there. And so that was part of that sort of deep ontology. But it also went to their knowledge of God. So one of the criticisms that you find in certain Eastern Fathers, oftentimes, of philosophy is not actually that philosophy is false. I've talked about this in other places. I just talked about this on the Paul Vanderklay show. And but somebody like Basil of Caesarea, when he's talking about wisdom and philosophy, sometimes people will read St. Paul talking about the wisdom of the world, and they read that phrase, right, the wisdom of the world, as somehow inherently negative, where Paul's saying, well, what the philosophers are doing is silly and ridiculous and false, right? And we're talking about the wisdom of God. That's not how Basil of Caesarea reads it. He actually reads the wisdom of the world as true analysis of the world. Like he actually does talk about the idea that what the wisdom of the world is a discerning of the fact that the world has certain structures to it, that it has certain teleological ends, right? I know that's redundant. It has telos, right? It has certain ends. It has nature. It has structure. It emerges from something like a mind. It's not random, chaotic happenstance and things like that. The philosophers are right when they discern that, but they're just discerning things about the world, right? That's the wisdom of the world, right? Or wisdom about the world. And what he suggests is that Christian knowledge of God, Christian wisdom, the knowledge of God that the Christians have is something higher than that. It's about the wisdom, right, that gave rise to the wisdom of the world, right? And so this is about God himself. And so when they also talk about the knowledge of God, what they're really talking about is they're talking about this sort of higher knowledge of God, this intimate connection with God that is deeper than what Aristotle has. So Aristotle, even when he offers true analysis about God, right, what God must be like given what the world is like, that's still just knowledge about God. Aristotle doesn't come to know God in some sort of intimate, connected way. And here's at least an analogy I find a little bit helpful in this. Let's think about it this way, right? An infant, comes into the world. The infant is nursing at its mother's breast. Does it know its mother? And the answer is yes, right? The infant has a deep and intimate connection with his mother, more so than, most people in the world, unless the mother has other kids who also have some experience of that type of connection. But does the infant have any sort of concept, any sort of analytic concept of what it means that I am, the son of this woman? And the answer is no, right? It doesn't have these sorts of like analytic structures of saying, well, I was gestated within her womb and I came out of her and I'm feeding her breasts, and these relational properties are what it means to say that I'm a son and, she's my mother and things like that. It doesn't have any of that. And yet it has a deeper and more intimate knowledge of his mother. That's what I mean when I say the Eastern Church Fathers have a concept of nous that is more than analysis. So the Eastern Church Fathers, contrary to some of these weird false claims that will float around about them, do not actually denigrate philosophy or the sort of analytic side of this, right? They actually acknowledge that philosophy discerns true things about the world. But their point is that discerning true things about the world structurally, conceptually, is not the same as having knowledge of God. And what the Christian is called to, what the Christian is offered from God, is something that is much more intimate. Right. So the infant, and we can see this in the fact that the infant doesn't even have the conceptual structures, but nonetheless still has the intimate connection. And it's that intimate connection with that God, that higher form of knowing, that more direct participatory knowledge and connection, knowledge of God and connection with God and participation in God. That's the thing that is the higher knowledge of God. And that's the thing that we are called to. So now the reason I bring that up is just to say, the Eastern Church Fathers have a much richer anthropology than just we're a computational machine that then makes choices about the things that we compute. And so for that reason, they always acknowledge just all this other stuff underneath our choices and our activities that we're unaware of. And like I said, this is the sort of thing that then when you move into, modern psychology and things like that, people are starting to dig into and saying, yeah, it seems like there's subconscious stuff. It seems like there's trauma. It seems like there's this, there's that. And so that recognition that there's a deeper anthropology is just, it's supremely relevant to the presumption that if we just had the evidence, we would do the thing. Because oftentimes it's not a problem of knowledge, right? You can oftentimes know what is true and sound, and it still doesn't move into action because there are deeper things at play, right? There's enslavement to the passions, right? There's other things that sit there underneath your analysis that end up sort of directing your choice and coloring your choice. So it's a massive presupposition that suggests that, if there's unbelief, there's only unbelief, only a rejection of God, rejection of belief in God, because the evidence is insufficient. And in fact, I think we can even just sort of in a contemporary way, we can start to see the falsehood of this, because obviously there has been quite a bit of interest and awareness about disinformation, about propaganda and things like that. And we all probably have seen now by this point the proof in real time that you can have people be told one thing that is false. You can show them the evidence that it's false, and they say, well, I still don't believe it, right? And that's obviously what we call confirmation bias, right? We've started to see the role of confirmation bias within our own culture, where people will be confronted with certain facts, certain falsehoods, right? Certain truths. And then somehow they're like, yeah, but I still hold this other thing. And they just sort of revert to something else. Well, that tells you that there's something else going on. And that something else, it could be social factors, right? The fact that they're a social animal, and I've talked about this in other places as well, right? Things like Peter Berger's stuff about how our beliefs are formed largely by these sort of, because we're social animals, there's a tendency for us to be sort of socially conditioned towards certain belief sets. It could be things like social conditions. It could be things like that I just want the other thing, right? Maybe I'm enslaved to my passions. I want to live a certain type of lifestyle, and, reality and facts and truth be damned, because I want what I want, right? Anyway, there's all these different things that can be in there. So it's a massive, massive presumption and clearly false premise to suggest that, well, unbelief demonstrates a lack of evidence, because that offers you a very thin and false anthropology. So right there, you have a couple of problems right out of the gate, right? First of all, there's the question of, well, how many people have actually looked at the evidence? Do we really have a full accounting of the evidence when we say that there's no such thing as rational unbelief? And then the second thing is that even if you want to point, well, there's certain very smart people who don't believe, that proves it. Unbelief does not in itself demonstrate a lack of evidence. So right there, you have two major problems in terms of the premises.
Hey, quick pause here. I'm going to be teaching an accredited college-level course that will begin in the coming months. But before I lock in the details, I want your input. You can take it for 3 credit hours with roughly 30 hours of lecture, homework, a grade, the whole shebang, including a transcript to send to the college of your choice, or you can audit the class, if you'd rather just sit in on the lectures with yours truly and do no homework. The class will be designed to work for anyone who can hang with an undergrad college course, be they advanced high school students, retirees, or anyone in between. So take a minute and fill out the poll. You'll find the link in the description below.
There's also, with this, there's also the question, and this is a valuable question to ask. Whenever you're in an issue like this, it's worth asking. Well, okay, so what should God have done, right? Like, what would constitute sufficient evidence, right? So you're suggesting that there's a certain state of affairs that is problematic. So what's the non-problematic state of affairs? So what would it look like, right? If the world was of such a kind that God gave sufficient evidence for belief in God, such that this problem falls apart, what would that world look like? And oftentimes it's not really clear what the answer to that question is. And part of the reason is because it goes into the sort of meta narrative, right? It goes into the sort of theological conundrum of, well, basically the sort of stuff we'll talk about in the positive side of the case. Like, well, how much evidence, what sort of evidence would constitute evidence sufficient to believe? Would such evidence override certain things like free will and all that sort of stuff? So you have to, at some point, once you start asking this question of saying, well, okay, let's grant for a minute your presumption that there's actually insufficient evidence. What would it look like, right? What would the alternative look like that you think is desirable? And that's always a worthy question. And that, of course, like I said, that gets us into the fact that there's a certain underlying theology and worldview and meta-narrative that's at work in this. Now, I'm going to shelve some of the theological narrative because I want to get back to that at the end, right? And largely because I'll just say candidly, most of the folks who deal with these problems in philosophy of religion are either Catholic or Protestant. They're not typically Orthodox, which means that their sort of underlying theological narrative, the worldview that they have, is not the same that I would have, right? And so I would take a slightly different tact in terms of how I would structure the sort of picture world that emerges. And so that's one of the reasons why all the questions about like belief and faith and salvation and damnation and why God would do this and all that sort of stuff, I want to come back to that at the end. But first, let's just put that on the shelf for now. But first, let's just talk about some of the responses, right, offered on the positive side, right? So we talked about the negative side, about where there's problematic presuppositions. Let's talk about the positive side of this, where people will offer certain instrumental explanations for the value of divine hiddenness, right? So this is really sort of saying, look, there is some sort of reason. It's not just a reason, right? There is a value. There's a positive utility in some ways, an instrumental utility, or just a general good having to do with God being hidden. So let's talk about what some of those are. One of the main places where people will start is they'll talk about the problem of free will, right? And I already hinted at this. I think I hinted at this earlier when I was talking about like, well, what would the world look like? People like John Hick. John Hick is known for his big fat book, Evil and the God of Love. He's known for other things, religious pluralism and things like that. He was an evangelical missionary, I think it was, who ended up abandoning evangelicalism and becoming a religious pluralist. Anyway, interesting guy. I met him before he died. We had lunch. But his dealing with the problem of evil in Evil and God of Love is that big fat book, his theodicy, right? His defense of God in the face of evil is one of the ones that he's known for. And in there, he offers what's called his, sort of epistemic distance argument, which is basically what he wants to suggest is that, and this is where sort of the problem of divine hiddenness becomes a subset of the problem of evil in certain formulations. And it was certainly the case in Hick, where what Hick wanted to suggest is that if God wants creatures to grow to maturity, if he wants to have free will, if he wants them to have, a loving relationship with them and so on, then there's a need that he creates some level of epistemic distance between him and his creatures. Because if God were just there in his full glory and things like that, not only would belief be necessary, but there would be a certain level of fear and things like that that would ultimately end up coercing choice. And then this would be problematic. Now, you'll notice this actually spills into some other sort of sub arguments, which you might actually already sense a brewing when you listen to that sort of thing. So one of those sub arguments is just to say that there are certain necessary conditions for certain things like love. And this is indeed one of the arguments. You find this not only in John Hick, you find this in folks like Paul Moser, who I mentioned earlier, where the claim is that love inherently has certain conditions to it. It's not coerced. It's something that you enter into freely. It's something that is not predicated on fear, right? Something that is not about like fear of punishment, which would be a go to the coercion thing, right? If I'm worried that if I reject you, I'll end up being severely punished, then I'm sort of coercively being held in that relationship. And so the idea being here that some sort of sense of self-determination and self-will that is without coercion, right, is essential. It's an essential trait to a true loving relationship. And so if God, since Schellenberg had as one of his premises a loving God, it's important that if what God wants is not just fearful devotion, but some sort of loving relationship, then a necessary condition for a loving relationship involves non-coercive conditions. I think there's something fair about that argument. Now, there is also something partially problematic about that argument, but let's just hold on to it for a minute. I think we all can sort of grant that, there's something, and you see this sort of thing, you can see this sort of thing in storytelling, right? When you're watching a story where, let's say, an old one would be Sleeping with the Enemy. I think that's what it was called, where you have some sort of abusive, coercive relationship where somebody's trapped in it and they can't get out of it. What is the other one? Something Clover Lane. Or is it like 8 Clover Lane? Anyway, any of these sort of like captive relationships where you see that one person desires the other person. And you see that that's lopsided, one-sided, but the other party is sort of like held by coercion, right? There's some sort of like trapped sort of conditions, right? Something that keeps them coercively or abusively sort of within the relationship. That strikes us as repugnant. Now, why does it strike us as repugnant? Well, it seems that one of the obvious things about it is that we recognize that relationships are not supposed to be that way. So if what the person really desires is they desire love, right? They want intimacy, they want connection, right? That non-coercion is an important part of it. That the other person having reciprocity of will and desire is an important part of it, right? That there's some sort of sense of, safety and things like that. All these sorts of things do point in the direction that, yes, it does seem to be true that if that's the sort of relationship that God desires, that, there are certain conditions. And it may well be the fact that God is in his, full glory, given the fact that you have throughout the biblical accounts that God basically is sublime in such a way that people are laid low in his presence. It would make it very difficult, of course, for God to unveil himself and not have the conditions be somehow coercive, right? Now, that's an interesting case. I think there's something interesting about it. I think the counter argument, right? If I were to sit here and try to make a counter argument, I would point to a couple of things. And let's see if I can counter my counters, right? One of the things that I would point to is I would say, well, what about the fact that the angels don't seem to have epistemic distance, right? And yet they somehow fall. So that seems to be a thing. So there's just a general question mark. If you're going to accept the Christian narrative, and clearly this argument, the way it's being framed with like faith and things like that and damnation, it's obviously being framed against the sort of Christian narrative. So, so that's a real question of saying, well, if you're going to suggest that the Christian narrative somehow wants this type of non-coercive relationship, and somehow believes that the presence of God is inherently coercive, such that it would have to be withdrawn, then how do you account for the fact that in the Christian narrative there's a fall? It seems like Adam and Eve do have access to God. It seems that the angels who fall had access to God. So the idea that somehow the current hiddenness of God is normal is actually contrary to the Christian narrative. Okay, good counter argument, Jacobs. Yes, let's see if you can come up with anything in response to that. The second problem is that I think this argument, well, let me put it this way. This argument seems to come down pretty hard on fear. Okay. And what I mean by that is that if you actually look at the biblical accounts of how it talks about fear of God, it actually doesn't treat it as inherently negative, and it doesn't treat it as somehow contrary to ultimately love of God. Now, it's true that the biblical account does talk about that perfect love casts out fear. But the biblical account seems to actually offer a worldview that suggests that fear is somehow the beginning of wisdom, right? It sort of moves you toward discipline. And then through discipline and growth and maturity, then you actually do come to see the goodness of God in its own right. And for that reason, then you come to love God, even though you started from a place of fear. So it's not obvious that the biblical text actually advocates this idea that fear is somehow contrary to love of God. So, another good counterpoint, Jacob. So what say you, right? Does that mean that you would reject this claim, right? That somehow epistemic distance is useful or something like that, or important to true uncoerced love of God? Well, let me say a couple of things. The first is, I'll say this. I do think that it's important to acknowledge, and this is the sort of thing I will come back to when I start talking about the sort of Eastern patristic view of things. I do think it's important to acknowledge that our current epistemic distance is actually not natural. Okay. And so that is going to be an important thing. So I do think when people begin to sort of talk about epistemic distance or divine hiddenness as if it's the natural state of affairs, as if it's part of the original design, I think that's actually problematic from a Christian perspective. However, does that mean there's no legitimacy to it? Okay. Well, I do think there is a case to be made here that there's a balancing act, that maybe even in Eden, there's epistemic distance. And here's what I mean. It's interesting that in the Eden account, right, even though Adam and Eve have access to God, that during the fall, God does seem to be absent. It's obviously done anthropomorphically, right, where they hear God walking in the garden and things like that. But there does seem to be some sort of withdrawal of God, not in the sense of a fall or a corruption, but some sort of absence of divine presence, right? Some sort of pulling back of divine presence in the midst of that temptation that then returns after the temptation. And so we don't obviously have an account like that of the angels, but that does seem to be a good proof, at least, that even in this sort of idyllic, sort of unfallen, that's what I mean by idyllic. Obviously, anybody who's listened to like me talk about the cosmic narrative, right? See man's place in the cosmos, knows that from an Eastern patristic perspective, Eden is not sort of the ideal state, like what we're supposed to become. But nonetheless, it is not fallen. It is not sinful. It's idyllic in that sense, right? That it's an uncorrupted sort of pre-fall state of affairs that opens the door for, things becoming what they're supposed to be. And so in that state, it does seem that there is a value, right? That there is an intentional withdrawing by God, his presence, and then a return after the temptation is complete. So I don't think it's entirely contrary, even if the current epistemic distance, even if the current divine hiddenness is somehow a product of corruption, which I believe it is, and we'll get back to, it does seem that the withdrawing of divine presence is something that perhaps did happen in Eden. And it is interesting that you also see this repeated in other places. So, for example, with Cain and Abel, right? Apparently, Cain and Abel still have access to the presence of God. God withdraws, the murder happens, right? And then God shows up again and he starts to talk, right, to Cain about where's your brother and all that. And so, again, you see this sort of thing happen where God withdraws and then he shows back up again. And in the withdrawal, you see, this corrupt human nature manifest itself in evil activities. And even, it's interesting, at Sinai, it's notable that when God descends on the mountain, what's interesting is that, the people are like, tell Moses in the account, tell God to stop talking, right? It's too scary and terrifying and the ground shakes and all that. Like, can you just like go talk to him for us? Because it's like too much. And Moses actually says like that he did this to make you fear so you won't sin against him, right? So Moses is acknowledging that something about the unbridled presence of God, and even there, it's not unbridled, right? He's veiled, right? This is something you see all throughout the Old Testament, where these sort of clouds or fire or things like that, they're actually always there to veil the presence of God. God is not the cloud, right? God is, within the cloud. You see this, for example, in the burning bush, where he descends down into the fires. Anyway, so you see this consistently, like that these are veiled, but even that veiled presence is too much for them, in the sense that, Moses suggests that this will instill fear, and that fear is meant to be there in order to keep you from sinning. So there is clearly in the biblical text, you do see this indication that the presence of God, unbridled, does somehow coercively, right, through fear, prevent a person from sinning. And you do see proof that does suggest that, yes, even in Eden, maybe that presence is withdrawn specifically during a temptation in order to preserve the integrity of the temptation. So that's how I would counter myself here. But I do think that all needs to be qualified, right? I think it needs to be qualified because the divine hiddenness we do experience, I do think is unnatural. And we'll get back to that. As for fear, I would counter myself with basically the very same evidence that I pointed out earlier, which is that the biblical text does seem to want to treat fear as a prelude to the type of love that God wants. So yes, it's sort of acknowledged as that there's a certain amount of discipline that goes into trying to deter us from sinning, just like a parent might discipline their child. But the idea, what you see here in the biblical worldview, and this actually goes to one of the other sort of arguments that's oftentimes leveled, is that it's not just a necessary condition for love, but there's also necessary conditions for maturity. And that what God desires is spiritual maturity, not just that you don't sin, not that you just choose him, right? But that at some point there is a growth into some form of spiritual maturity. And that's where I think the argument about fear is really relevant, because clearly people like, John in 1 John, when he's talking about perfect love casting out fear, he's talking about a movement from, right, a growth, a maturity from, well, I was afraid of hell, right? Or I was just afraid of God, right? And from that, I ended up moving toward a place of beginning to see the goodness of the ways of God. And when I started to see the goodness of his commandments, and I started to see the goodness of his wisdom, and then I started desiring those things because I recognized they're good, not out of fear, but out of love, right? Or I recognize his love for us in those things, right? In his wisdom, in his redemption of us, and so on. And so then I moved out of this sort of infantile restraint based on fear into maturity, where through these disciplines I began to see the goodness of God's wisdom. And now I want those things because they're good, right? Like that's what I want. And that does seem to be how you sort of put these two things together in the biblical text, is that the biblical text most certainly does seem to advocate the idea that there is a form of spiritual maturity, right? Spiritual maturity of a kind that God desires, where you actually have come to see the good and desire the good and love the good. In fact, let me just say this, since I said desire the good. I've talked about this before, that Basil of Caesarea talks about the fact that there's in one of his works where he's doing sort of a Q&A thing, right? People are asking him spiritual questions and he's offering spiritual responses, guidance. And one of the questions that they ask is, they're like, teach us how to love, like, how do we love God, right? Teach us how to love God. How do we learn to love God? And Basil responds in a very classical way, which is to say that you don't need to be taught to love God. You already love God. And of course, this might be confusing to people because they're like, well, what are you talking about? I'm not sure everybody loves God. But Basil's point is something very much like what you see all throughout ancient philosophy. So people like Plato end up coming to the conclusion that particular goods all have their source in the good, right? This sort of transcendent source that unifies them, and that they sort of cascade from as, particularized samplings of the good that take on all these sorts of different, incarnations, so to speak. And ultimately, Plato concludes that the good is God. And Christianity ends up echoing the sentiment, right? This notion, this conclusion that somehow God is the good, right? That goodness is this sort of manifestation of God himself, the divine. And so one of the things that you see all throughout Christianity is the idea that evil is never done for evil's sake, right? Like people don't just sit there and go, this is an evil thing, therefore I shall do it because I love evil. Mustache twirling villain here. No, what actually happens is we end up seeing some good, and then even though it's sort of twisted or corrupted or something like that, we end up embracing this sort of twisted or corrupted thing because of the good. Some of these things, it's really sort of obvious, right? Like when we talk about, let's say, when you talk about, sex, right? The pleasure that you get from sex is something that can obviously lead to different types of distortions of sex. The pleasure of the goods of food and nourishment, right, are some of the things that can lead to gluttony. Alternatively, it may be that you don't actually eat because of necessarily the pleasure of it, but maybe for some people, it has to do with satiating a certain pain and feeling comfort, right? And so in this way, right, that's also a good. When we engage in sort of like meanness, right? It's sort of a common trope at this point that bullies, right? They're really just trying to, make themselves feel better. They're really insecure and they're just trying to make themselves feel better about themselves. So they're asserting their power and things like that. And these two are goods, right? In the sense of, power is actually in itself a good. It can be wielded for bad, but also the sorts of, satiating that type of insecurity, the desire for some sort of stability, for groundedness, for control, right? For addressing the pains that might be inside that sort of drive a person to go down this road. It's always the fact of the matter is that with every evil, what you end up seeing is it's in some ways parasitic. And so this is something we will talk about this when I do my Problem of Evil series. But this is one of the reasons why Christianity had always said that evil is a privation, right? It is a privation of the good, meaning evil never sort of exists on its own as its own substantive reality. It's always some good that's then twisted, right? So like blindness is an absence of a good, right? It's that the good is that the eye can see. And then it's when you take that away that you get this blindness. And this is one of the reasons why all throughout the church fathers, what you start to see them echoing certain other ancient sentiments from people like Plato, is the idea that virtues are actually positive traits, right? You cultivate courage, right? Cowardice is not actually a positive reality. It's an absence of courage, right? So when you go through the virtues and you're talking about things like wisdom or justice, or you're talking about things like courage or temperance, like these are positive additive traits. And when you're talking about the sort of flip side, when you're talking about vices, what you're talking about is certain absences, right? And it's when those absences come in that you end up getting a twisted reality. And because the thing, right, you are a positive reality, when there's that absence and it's twisted, right, you end up getting an evil, right? You end up getting corruption. So evil is never sort of this substantive reality on its own. Now, the reason that's important is because when you're talking about spiritual maturity, right? There is this idea that what needs to happen is this movement into something substantial and grounded, right? And this goes to a point that I actually have talked about in other places. There's specifically an article I did related to the free will defense. And I talked about certain deficiencies of the free will defense that I'll talk about in greater length in a moment. But suffice it to say that one of the things that you see is that creatures are inherently beings that move from potentiality to actuality. That's a big part of what the article is that I talked about there. And so in moving from like sort of unformed to formed, it's inevitable that we have to go through this stage of acquisition, right? There is something that needs to be required. So when a child comes into the world full of potentiality, the potential to walk, the potential to talk, the potential to reason, the potential to engage in moral activity and things like that. There is a movement from those potentialities to actualities, right? Those things have to be brought into being. They don't just sort of like burst out of the womb and they're a fully formed adult. Instead, what you get is you get the growth, you get the movement and that sort of thing. And so when talking about spiritual maturity, right, this is an important feature of one of the other responses to this problem of divine hiddenness, is the idea that what God desires from his creatures is not just that we believe, right? Is not just that you obey out of fear, but that there is some sort of growth and movement. And like I said, this is what Basil of Caesarea is getting at when he's talking about you already love God. So what Basil's talking about there in that sort of context is he's saying that underneath, whenever you do a thing, right or wrong, you're doing it because you perceive the good of the thing, right? You perceive the good of power, you perceive the good of safety, you perceive the good of pleasure, you perceive the good of comfort. But the problem is your desires are scattered and you don't recognize that they all come from a common source, right? That there is this God who is the good from which they all cascade. And if you saw the fact that they all cascade from that God, you would see that you already love God, right? Because you love all of these little sort of instantiations of him. And if you saw that, then you would see that all of your different disparate, desires could be harmonized. And how would they be harmonized? Through spiritual simplicity, meaning that you recognize that all of these desires point in a common direction. And if you love God, then you can also love in a harmonious way all these sorts of disparate goods. The problem is we don't see that, right? We just see these sort of like fragmented goods here and we get really myopic and we do this thing and we do it in a distorted sort of way and things like that. So Basil's point is not that you need to be taught to love God, right? You already love God because you love the good. The problem is that you need to come to grow up and see that all the various scattered goods actually have a common source, which is God. And then through that, you need to come to a place of wisdom where you understand how, to properly order yourself within the world and to love this higher form of wisdom and attain spiritual simplicity, where you can enjoy all of the lower goods in a harmonious way because you also love their source, right? You love them properly. They have their proper place in your life, in your heart, in your world, right? In your thinking, in your actions, and so on. And now they're harmonized because you love their source. And through loving their source, right, all of these things sort of fall into place in the proper sort of way. But that is a process of maturity. And so this goes to this whole point about spiritual maturity, the idea that at first what happens is a person has to move from sort of an initial type of fear, right? That oftentimes, and if we're talking about, in a fallen world, pain, falling down, attaining humility, right? There's all sorts of things that need to be attained in order to move us towards some form of spiritual maturity. And this goes to this other point, right? Which is that oftentimes with people like Paul Moser or others, they'll talk about the fact that it's not just that love has certain conditions, it's that maturity has certain conditions. There's a need for some type of humility. There's a need for a certain type of, repetition, a certain type of recognition of the goodness of God and a choosing of that. And that sort of like spiritual maturity that you see in people who have been formed in virtue does not happen overnight, right? It is something that you have to move into. And this was my point about the infants. The idea that, that we as creatures don't just burst out of the womb fully formed. Everything about reality, everything about a creature is something that begins in potential and then moves into actuality. Our ability to walk is something that begins in potential, and we have to go through growth pains, falling down, strengthening our legs, all that sort of stuff as we move into, right, a walking being. Language is something that we have to move through. We slowly fumble around and we listen and we observe, and then we start to make weird noises, and then slowly we begin to figure out how to actually form those sounds and communicate and grammar and all the rest. Right. And so the point is to say that that trait right there is a trait of creatureliness. And that trait is something that means that spiritually it's no different. Right. So there's a real sort of oddity in the presumption that somehow belief in God and the avoidance of hell or whatever is sitting here underneath the presupposition of the argument is something that is overnight or instantaneous or something like that. But nothing in human experience is that way. Nothing in terms of the goods that we acquire in terms of reason or, various capacities, skills in art or whatever it is. None of those things happen overnight. They happen through repetition. They have certain conditions by which we have to go through growth pains. And through those growth pains and repetition, that's where we start to move into some sort of acquired skill, where we acquire the ability to walk, where we acquire the ability to talk, where we acquire the ability to reason, where we acquire the ability to do art and painting, music, whatever it may be. And so the claim here by somebody like Moser, and I think he's right, is that spiritual maturity works the same way, that when we're talking about the sort of love that God desires, it's not merely, look right there, there's a big flaming being in the sky, and therefore I believe, and now I'm going to go to heaven. That's not the sort of thing that, first of all, that's not reality. That's not the world we live in. That's not what God's calling us to. And that, again, is going to the sort of theological presuppositions. But also, it's just the sort of, in terms of the nature of creaturely spirituality and formation and things like that, that's not the thing that God's calling us into. And this goes to this one of the other presuppositions that I mentioned, that the argument conflates faith and belief, right? As if somehow the sort of height of religiosity or something like that, spiritual maturity, is just that I'm analytically oh, I know that God exists. I know that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe in him. We're good, right? And that's the whole thing that, that is a bit dubious about the argument, because it sort of reduces spirituality to belief, faith to belief. Whereas, again, now here I'm going to definitely be speaking from my Eastern Orthodox side of things, but that the sort of thing that God's calling us into, the sort of thing that God really desires, is the sort of thing that we see in this biblical relationship between fear and love of God, that it's something that has to be grown into, that you have to move from the infantile discipline, I'm afraid mom and dad are going to send me to my room, to seeing oh, there's actually wisdom in the way that they're raising me, right? And that's the thing that every parent desires. Let's put aside spirituality for a minute. Every parent, when they teach their child morality, they're hoping that the child moves from a place of, well, lying, you're going to get punished for lying, or you're going to get punished for being, not cleaning your room and, being wildly disorganized. You're going to get punished for not doing your homework and not being a hard worker and so on, to eventually internalize and recognizing, oh, there actually is a good to hard work. There actually is good to truth telling. There actually is a good to not harming other people, right? There is an inherent good in not stealing and things like that. The desire is that the entire intent of a parent is to move through that same process, right? That same process of moving from instilling fear, right, of something like punishment, to a growth and maturity of being able to actually understand the structures of reality and see that there's actually a good in the things your parents are telling you to do, so that when you are finally an adult and standing on your own 2 feet, that you will be a morally and spiritually upright being, right? That's the goal. And so it does seem that there is legitimacy to the idea that what's happening in the case of God, right, is that God is not just interested in, I analytically believe that there's a God, right? Or something like that. That what God desires is us to move into a state where we recognize not just, well, let's use Basil. I talked about the wisdom of the world versus the higher wisdom, where we come to recognize, we move from that place of seeing that there is a certain wisdom that ordered the world and things like that to this higher knowledge of God, where we actually know God, we participate in God, where we move from mere fear of God and the possibility of accountability and punishment to ultimately seeing the goodness of God and the goodness that's there in his commandments and actually embracing those on our own and becoming good ourselves, right? Where we actually mirror God in the proper sort of way. Now, I mentioned that I did an article sometime back on the free will defense. And this is where I want to add one thing. I want to supplement this argument with something that was mentioned in that piece, which is I had argued that there was a deficiency in the free will defense, and and here was particularly about the problem of evil. But I was saying one of the things that the argument always presumes is actually that free will means having the ability to do good or evil. And while I do believe that free will, according to tradition, it involves self-determination and contrary choice, I talk about that in my episode on free will, which again is linked below. I will say this: Christianity has always held, as I also talk about in that episode, that God has free will. He has the power of contrary choice, but because he is by nature good, none of the choices, that does not involve the possibility of him doing evil. In other words, God being good and being what he is, whenever he expresses himself through contrary choice, he's expressing his underlying nature, and his underlying nature is good. Now, this, in the context of a free will defense, actually raises a rather thorny question, which is to say, well, if it's possible to have a being who is fully good and has free choices, obviously the saints get there. So if that's the case, right, that God is that way, the saints eventually become that way, then why doesn't God just make creatures who are already fully good, and yet also free? That's I think a really that's a blind spot right there in the free will defense. And the thing that I address in that article is I actually point out that there are very good metaphysical reasons why, according to the Eastern Church Fathers, God can't do that. Okay, now I'm not going to belabor this with a whole bunch of metaphysics. You can go and look at that article. We can link to that below too, if you want to see like the full metaphysical breakdown of that, the case that I make in that article. But the long and short is this: that the nature of creatures, according to the Eastern Church Fathers, and this is something that comes out in the Arian dispute, right? The first major dispute of the ecumenical councils. In that dispute, because part of the question that they're really asking is whether or not the Son of God is a divine or a creature, right? Arius is saying he's a creature. Athanasius is saying he's divine. You end up getting into the metaphysics of what is God and what is a creature. And one of the things that you get in that distinction is you get the very clear differentiation that what makes a creature is that a creature moves from potentiality to actuality. A creature is a possible being that could or could not exist. Contingency and becoming, or generation, coming into being, is something that is innate to creatureliness per se. And so the point of this is to say that because the nature of creatureliness is of such a kind that you were a potential being that moves into actuality, creatureliness itself entails, like, metaphysically necessary. It's metaphysically entailed it's as entailed in the concept of a creature as four-sided as is entailed in a square, that a creature is mutable, that a creature moves from potential to actual. In other words, what the Eastern Church Fathers ultimately end up arguing, and this is the sort of thing I make the point in that article to show, is that they suggest that God can't create a fully realized, fully actual being, because the nature of creatureliness, to be created, is to move from potential to actuality, to move from a possible thing to a concrete thing. And that movement is inherently a movement into being. That movement is inherently a mutation. That movement is inherently a progression of some kind. And so the claim is that not even God can create fully realized, fully actualized beings. Now, add to this that you have free will, that what free will is, according to the Eastern Church Fathers, is self-determination. That's what the term means, right? The idea, and amongst the pagans, one of the phrases they like, and it's echoed in some places, like in John of Damascus, the things that rely on us, right? And so they're drawing a distinction between the things that God does unilaterally and the things that we do, right? Our contributions to the world. And even the term, right, self-determination ends up indicating like this self-authority, like this self-substancing is actually what the term sort of almost literally breaks down to. And so the idea here being that if sort of these moral traits, right, if the traits of freedom, the moral traits of freedom are something that depend on free will, and this is again a case, again, see that other episode I did on free will. Moral traits do not sort of emerge with regard to plants, right? Plants are not moral beings. Animals are not moral beings. The reason you and I are moral beings and can have moral traits is because we have this capacity of reason and free choice. And so if moral traits are something that emerge out of self-determination, then the fact of the matter is that that self-determination is indispensable to creating morally upright beings. And so you sort of get these twin points of this argument, where the idea is that God can't create a being that's fully determined, and he can't determine a self-determining being, right? Both of those land in contradiction. And so for that reason, when making beings, first of all, when making creatures, God inevitably, of metaphysical necessity, makes something that is mutable, that is changeable, that goes through a progression, because the first act of progression is coming into being. And then secondly, when talking about moral beings, part of that progression is its own self-determination. And so this is where I would add that as another layer on top of this argument, because it's really important to understand this isn't that like, well, God could make us such a way where we don't progress and we don't struggle and we don't grow and we don't acquire and we don't mature. Instead, what you see in the Eastern Church Fathers, they actually argue a metaphysical necessity. That's just what a creature is, and not even God can make it otherwise. And so this is where you actually move into territory of suggesting it's not just that God desires love and these are necessary conditions of love. It's not just that God desires maturity and these are the conditions that happen to be in place. Instead, according to the Eastern Church Fathers, at least, the argument is that these are inherently metaphysically necessary conditions. In other words, just like, and again, now we're moving into other territory like realism. They are realists, right? So for folks who have ever sort of looked at me talking about, I have my inaugural episode on realism, right? The most important question. I have my defense, the case for realism. I have the Q&A where I answer whether God can make a rock so heavy that, not even he can lift it. One of the things that I talk about is that according to the Christian realists, yes, God can do anything, but by thing, they mean thing. In other words, not every semantic combination we might come up with is a thing. Some things are just semantic gobbledygook and they're nonsense. So when talking about a square without four sides or something like that, you can put those words together, but they're not meaningful. And so according to the Christian realists, when you're talking about these sort of logical structures of reality, not even God can make a square that's not a square. Not even God can make a square that's a circle. Not even God can make, free creatures that are not free. Not even God can make a creature that's immutable, right? That doesn't undergo progression. And that comes out really, really clear in the Arian dispute, because Arius is struggling to try to say certain things about the Son of God, like that, well, maybe God makes him immutable. And everybody on the pro-Nicene, on the Orthodox Christian side of things, say that's impossible. Not even God can make an immutable creature, because the first act of creatureliness is mutation, is a coming into being. So if he's a creature, he of metaphysical necessity undergoes that progression of moving into being. So it's important here to understand that this is not just saying like, well, love could be this way. Maturity could be this way. It could be that God has created conditions such that this is the progression we go through. Actually, the case seems to be stronger that when you look at the ways in which the Eastern Church Fathers understand creatureliness per se, free will per se, spiritual maturity per se, goodness per se, as contrasted with evil, what you begin to see is that these sorts of responses actually indicate that these of metaphysical necessity are the nature of things, that not even God can make it otherwise. Now, again, I have to throw on the caveat here that I don't want to normalize hiddenness. And so this is something I'm going to come back to. But I will say that there is legitimacy to the idea that when you're talking about creatureliness, the idea that we have to undergo that sort of progression, like I talked about with language, or where I talked about, learning to walk or things like that. Those sorts of things, the idea that creatures are things that have to undergo that sort of movement into being, the idea that free will is self-determination and has to undergo that sort of progression of choosing this type of thing. Those things do seem to be metaphysical necessities. They're inherent to the structure of spiritual maturity. They're inherent to the structure of creatureliness and creaturely growth and love and maturity of the kind that God desires. And probably just of love generally. I actually kind of hate that caveat of the kind that God desires. The fact of the matter is, when we talk about love, like coerced conditions of love are not love, right? So the claim is stronger that love and spiritual maturity per se actually have to be this way. And so while it may be the sort of thing that we look at and we go, we wish it were not so. It may be a metaphysical necessity. It just has to be so, right? There is no other way. It may well be, and I have to say this, right? It may well be that we're like, well, but I would like to be fully jacked while still eating whatever I want and not working out. Okay. Like, I understand. Believe me, I understand. Sounds lovely, not possible. That's just part of the structure of reality. And so it is. So it seems to be here in terms of love and maturity. Now, we've started to move into territory where I'm moving into more Jacobsian sort of idiosyncrasies. Obviously, I've already appealed to my own sort of work related to the metaphysics of the Eastern Church Fathers and the sort of supplemental work I've done on the free will defense. I want to talk about a couple of other things, and this is where we'll sort of put a bow on this for today. I want to talk about a couple of other things. First, I want to talk about some additive things I'd like to offer in terms of proofs for the existence of God. And then the second thing I'd like to talk about is just sort of the overall meta-narrative that sits underneath someone like Schellenberg's argument. So starting with the proofs for the existence of God. Typically the proofs, there's a couple of things that I'd just like to say about this. Typically with regard to the proofs, a lot of people are sort of like negative about the proofs because it leaves them cold. And I think that's unfair. Okay. I think many of the proofs work I'm an advocate of them. I don't think they work in the sense of necessarily persuading somebody being the most palpable, sort of potent way to persuade somebody. Now, I will say this, just like there are so many people who want to say like, hey, nobody would ever you can't prove the existence of God. Oftentimes people will also say things like, no one's ever been converted by the proofs for the existence of God. That's actually not true. Okay. And so one of the people that is a really, important example of this is Edward Feser. So Edward Feser is an interesting guy. I think he does very good work. I like him a lot, and he's actually pretty funny. His blog is really sort of a hoot in how he deals with things, as is his sort of book that he wrote. Let's see, what is it called, like The Last Illusion or something like that. It'll come to me. But his book about his book against the new atheists. Anyway, it was. He's a good writer. He's clever. He's funny. He's interesting. But part of the thing about Feser's story that's intriguing is that Feser was an atheist, right? So he was sort of like a materialist, reductionistic atheist type who was a professor of philosophy. He is a professor of philosophy, as far as I know still. But he was going to teach a class. And in this class, he was going to have to talk about proofs for the existence of God. It was just part of the curriculum. And it's like, man, this is going to be a really boring class if I can't do something to make these obviously fallacious and dumb arguments, at least seem somewhat palatable. And so he decided to go ahead and try to dig into them and like steel man them. And actually in the process, he became convinced like they work. Man, I'm wrong. And so Edward Feser did undergo an intellectual conversion, right, based on digging into the proof. So I actually don't believe it's true that no one could ever be convinced by the proofs for existence of God. Now, I do grant that Phaser is sort of the outlier. I do think most folks who, when they're talking about looking for proof for the existence of God, they're not looking for an analytic sort of thing. And very few of us are so odd as to be so heavily analytic to be, persuaded of these sorts of things. I say us because I'm probably in that category that is, persuadable in that sort of way, where I take the analytic side that seriously. But I don't want to say like nobody is that way, right? So just like I would say, where I dismiss as an all too popular myth that there are no proofs, you can't prove that God exists. I would so say the same thing about, the very casual aside where people are like, yeah, but nobody would ever convert on the basis of the proofs for the existence of God. That's not true. It's happened, right? It's happened. The other thing I would say is this. The proofs are typically, when people think about the proofs, they think about the sorts of things that I mentioned, right? Teleological argument, the cosmological argument, Kalam's cosmological argument, the ontological argument, things like that. And I think all of those are worth looking at. Big advocate of the argument for contingency, for example. So I think those are all interesting arguments worthy of consideration. But some of the arguments that I'm more inclined toward are a little more existential. And I don't mean existential in the sense of I go into crisis and, I hit rock bottom. And so now I say, where is God? What I mean is having a little bit more to do with just our sort of day-to-day experiences and being less sort of a math problem. And there's a couple of these that I would just advocate. One of these I'm not going to belabor because I'm going to actually have on somebody who I'm planning on interviewing, a professor of philosophy from Northern Arizona University, who I'm very close with. But his dissertation was on actually on the highest good, right? And this argument that somehow the disparate sort of goods of the world have to have some sort of highest good to which they point. And he has pointed out that argument that people, sort of talk about, that they work through, is something that, actually does indicate, a proof, right? That could be taken as a proof. And there's an existential component to that. Now, since he's the one who I really want to talk about that, I'm going to just sort of like put that on the shelf from now. That's a teaser. Be watching for my interview with Dr. James Joyner, which, God willing, at some point we'll get our schedules to line and I'll get him on here. But one of the other ones that you might expect is just something that is, very near and dear to this podcast, which is realism. And so in my case for realism, if you go and watch that episode, one of the things that you end up seeing is how I talk about the fact that it's very hard to dispense with realism and still be a thinking, reasoning being. In fact, I would argue it's impossible. I talked about it. I don't know if I mentioned in that one or in a different episode, but I mentioned the quote from Gilson, who's a realist. And what he said is the first step to convincing somebody of realism is to help them realize that they've always been a realist. The second step is to help them to see that the moment they cease to play a role in a specific argument, meaning like they're playing anomalous or opposing realism, they will go back to being a realist. And the third step is to get them to ask why. Obviously, Gilson's point is to say, if the mind inherently sort of works and operates in a certain way, and it can't stop operating in that way, and you just keep on reverting back to it, then maybe that indicates that it operates in that way for a reason. Like maybe that's reflective of the nature of the world. Here it occurs to me, I haven't done my obligatory defining of realism. So let me just go ahead and quick do that. This is where those of you who have watched every episode can sigh and go, yet again. My apologies. I don't presume everybody's watched every episode. But realism basically is the whole point that it recognizes that when we look into the world, what we see is we begin to think in terms of structures, right? Genera, species, common properties, things like that. And the question of realism is, why does the mind do that? Does the mind do that because those structures are out there and they're real, like the world really is ordered in this sort of way, and the mind is identifying that order and abstracting it? Or is the world just sort of random happenstance stuff, and the mind needs to organize it, so we invent structures and we impose it on the world, but that's not really how the world is. If you say those structures are real, then you're realist. If you say that they're invented, they're names, then you are a nominalist, from the Latin nomen. Okay. And everybody who follows this channel knows that I am an advocate of realism, right? And so one of the things that I've talked about is that when it comes to the way we think and we reason about the world, in the case for realism, I talked about this very fact that Gilson talks about, the idea that we can't stop thinking in realist terms, that we just sort of default into that. And it's reflexive, right? Everything about your perception is inherently realist. When you look at the world, it's not your eyes that differentiate that, that's a desk and that's a floor and, that's a human sitting at the desk and things like that. Your eyes don't do that. You don't see that. Your mind does that, right? Your eyes give you information. It's the mind that, automatically, so quick that you don't even notice it, you take it for granted, starts to break things into genera and species and common properties and those sorts of things. And so that's part of the innate structure of mind. And I gave all the reasons why, things like logic breaks down unless realism is true, because logic is based on sets. I talked about scientific induction and the fact that scientific induction becomes fallacious unless you actually have, realist convictions. And so for my part, I look at this and I say, and also what I argued in there is that I think realism naturally points to God. Right? Because what you end up with in this case is you end up with the conclusion that the ordering of the world, that the world is not matter from which mind emerges, but rather matter is organized according to the principle of mind, which indicates that mind is prior to it. And so you are in a world, this is the thing that the Greeks, the pagan philosophers, came to very quickly, very early in pagan philosophy. You see again and again and again, whether they're talking about the logos or the nous, or they're talking about love, they're talking about the idea that matter is not just random happenstance. It is orderly, and it's ordered according to the principles of mind, which means there must be some sort of prior undergirding rational something that's giving rise to it, that's ordering it, that's bringing it into this sort of structured reality. And I think that's quite true. And so I've talked about that in my case for realism. I also, in my appearance on Jonathan Peugeot, I talked about how this is one of the things that makes perception inherently mystical, in the sense that if what's the case is that I am perceiving certain structures of mind, which are ultimately the divine mind, and I am somehow pulling those out and participating in those. The very act of perception is some sort of participation in the divine mind. And so in this sense, it's sort of, mystical, if you want to call it that, the idea that I can't help but in the act of perception itself be encountering divinity. In the act of perception itself, I encounter the divine mind. Now, so I want to say that there are certain things like that I find those more compelling because they go to the level of experience. They pair the sort of rational side with experience. Let me give it another thing here that I think is really interesting. Just another example of these sorts of existential arguments. I think it's interesting that we as human beings have to rationalize our behavior. And this sort of goes to the sort of thing that Basil of Caesarea was talking about, that we love the good, right? And we do things because of the good. And that's actually why we do them. But even when we twist it, right, there's this sort of need to justify the twisting. So I think it's intriguing that even an atheist, right, something horrible happens, they're like, why, right? And so when people, cry out like, why did this happen? They're actually expressing a couple of things. First of all, they're expressing the idea that the world ought to be just and the world ought to be fair. Now, that's really weird, right? Because we're in a world that, from what we can tell, just on the day-to-day level, on the experiential level, we have very clear evidence that the world is not fair, right? Good people have bad things happen to them. Bad people have good things happen to them, and so on. People do not get their just desserts, and so on. And obviously, this is part of why it's important in the Christian narrative that there's final judgment and there's a sorting out of these sorts of things and so on. But what's interesting is, despite the empirical evidence that our world is not fair and that our world is not just, that somehow we still know it ought to be just, which is why then we sort of reflexively, not analytically, reflexively cry out, why? And that same impulse actually comes through in our own behavior. So what's interesting is that when we do something wrong, we justify it, right? We rationalize it. Well, I did this thing wrong, but like it wasn't really wrong because, right? And then we try to find some sort of way of absolving ourselves, of rationalizing, of justifying our decision and getting ourselves off the hook. Now, why? I think what that testifies to is the fact that we, in our own structures of mind, in our heart, we recognize that the world is supposed to be just and fair. And there's something unacceptable. There's something devastating about the idea that the reason the world is not fair is because of me, right? So in recognizing that the world ought to be a certain way, we also recognize that we ought to be part of that certain way. And that's one of the reasons why we can't stomach, we can't swallow the idea that the reason the world is not right, the reason the world has gone wrong is because I did it, right? And that's one of the reasons why we have to go through and we have to rationalize, we have to justify our decisions, because we can't embrace that, right? We know how the world ought to be. Those sorts of things, I mean, those are just a couple of very quick examples, but I find those sorts of proofs to be some of the more intriguing ones, because I think they're the sorts of things that point us in a direction of direct human experience, just reflecting on our own way of approaching the world, our own way in which our mind works, that is a little more immediate in terms of saying, well, why am I this way? Why is my mind this way? And maybe this very fact that at every moment my mind functions this way, at every moment I behave this way, at every moment I think this way, I can't stop thinking this way. And that's tied into something that indicates that God exists. I think those sorts of proofs are a little more, at least for me, I find them more impactful because they're not a mere sort of mathematical equation. They're the analysis that somehow pairs with these sort of experiential sides of reality. So anyway, I just wanted to offer that regarding the proofs of the existence of God. Let me talk a little bit more about the meta-narrative. And here I want to talk a bit more about the problem of hiddenness per se and the fact that I said it's not natural. And I also want to talk a little bit about just some of the presumptions that you find in Schellenberg's theological case. Also, one last thing I want to say about the proofs is that it's kind of interesting that this objection typically actually presumes that God should be evident without effort. And I want to call that out because that's far from an obvious premise. As I had said, when we talked about the order of nature and the order of reality, everything that's good and worthwhile actually requires some amount of effort, right? Learning to walk, learning to talk, learning to paint, right? Whatever it is. So it's a really sort of odd thing that suggests that somehow learning, right, about God or coming to know God or something like that should be the sort of thing that should just be automatically obvious without any sort of effort. And this is one of the things that like I find it really interesting, right? Like when people will sometimes object that it's like, well, why isn't God more evident? Right. And one of the things I'm always curious about is how much time have you actually spent, trying to pursue God, trying to investigate the proofs and not just pursuing God. It's rather intriguing that if you actually look at the nature of the God of the Bible, he demands things of you, right? He demands that you purify yourself. He demands that you repent, right? He demands he's not like the demons, right? The demons actually require nothing of you. This is one of the reasons why Ouija boards work without repentance, right? So I can go ahead and I could talk to a demon. It's happy to talk back to me, right? Because it has ulterior motives. But God wants something else from you, right? God desires that you are penitent, right? That you purify yourself, that you begin to approach him in a certain manner. And incidentally, yes, that does seem to be, in part divine design and desire. It also does seem to be that there's a metaphysical side of this. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you look at the ways in which unholy things respond to God, they oftentimes end up reacting very negatively. And this is, I don't want to get too far aside on this, but this is actually a critical feature of how the Eastern Church Fathers understand a lot of divine talk, right? So when looking at sort of Pharaoh and Moses, for example, people are sometimes troubled by the fact that, God says he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart, because they read that in this sort of Calvinistic way, where God's going to make Pharaoh do bad things and then punish him for doing bad things. And people are rightly troubled by that because it sounds unjust, because it is unjust. But the Eastern Church Fathers don't read it that way. They understand that to be that God knows what sort of man Pharaoh is. He's bad soil, right? And so when he shows up, he's going to harden and crack. And this is what they observe about Moses and Pharaoh, that when God shows up and presents himself to Moses, and when he shows up and presents himself to Pharaoh, he does the same thing, right? He shows up, he declares who he is, he demonstrates it by miracle, he makes a demand, and the reactions are very different. Moses becomes a saint, Pharaoh becomes hardened, prideful, rebellious, and ultimately is destroyed. And the reason this is important is because Eastern Church Fathers consistently understand there to be something synergistic about the dynamic between God and creatures, where when things are bad soil and resistant to God, they begin to harden and crack. When things are receptive to God, you get good and flourishing results. So the idea being that the effects of God's presence are not unilateral, right? They are synergistic effects, meaning the condition of the thing receiving it will somehow play a part in how it is received. Anyway, I point that out in order to say that there's a real question when we talk about this, that God, sort of demands certain things of you. One of the questions is that epistemologically, right, if it's true that there are certain conditions to experience a thing, then can we say that we have adequately tested whether that thing is so unless we've engaged in those conditions? I apologize for the very abstract way of saying it. But let's just say, for example, that we said, well, hey, there's certain things up there in space, and in order to see them, because your eyes are not actually suited to just sort of look through the look that far out, you need some sort of telescope in order to amplify them, something like that. And you're like, well, I've never looked through the telescope, so I don't see the evidence, so I don't believe it. Similarly, if we're like, well, there's something, up on top of the mountain, and you're like, well, I don't want to climb the mountain, so I don't believe it's there, right? There's if there's certain things that, are required of you, you have to climb the mountain to find out, or you have to dig into this thing to find out, or you have to put on these lenses to find out. Sometimes knowledge has certain necessary conditions. And if it's true that God will, reveal himself to anyone who seeks him or something like that, then there is a real question of, have you sought him? Right. And so this is where there's both the sort of analytic question of how much time have you actually devoted to the proofs to actually see if any of them are sound, right? There's that sort of intellectual side, but then there's also this existential side, that God is a person, right? That God is a being, and that being has certain demands, right? Has certain conditions in order to reveal himself. So this is one of those things that, it really goes to the question of when you're saying, well, there's not sufficient evidence for the existence of God, not only putting aside the question of, well, what would be sufficient, right? That question that sort of needs to be answered in order for the objection to hold water. But there's also this question of like, well, have you actually engaged in the sort of work necessary in order to make that assessment? Because there's both sort of the analytic side, right? But then there's also this existential side. We're talking about a being who actually has choices to make in this potential relationship with you. And if he's laid out demands in order for you to assess, right, whether or not he has sufficiently revealed himself, you would have to actually do the experiment, right? You would actually have to climb the mountain, so to speak, in order to see if he will meet you there as he suggested, right? As he says he will. So anyway, there's that side of things. But this actually raises one further layer to the problem that begins to emerge. And this problem is something that's sometimes referred to, it sort of overlaps with a problem called moral luck, right? The idea that not everybody is created equal, right? So first of all, some of us are more analytically gifted than others. And so some of us might be in a better position to grasp certain evidence for the existence of God than others. Circumstantially, right? Some people may be thrust into a position where they have parents who are just handing them, all the truths about God and steering them accordingly, and other people are not, right? And so this gets into another layer of the objection that suggests that even where there is evidence for God, if we grant that there's some amount of evidence for God, then you have this problem of the fact that not all of us have equal access to it. And so then you run into this problem that if this is so important, right, really it should be that every person has access. So if we granted, for example, right, the objector says, well, if we grant that there is sufficient evidence for the existence of God, one of the problems is that not everybody has access to it or equal access to it. And if it's really the case that every person, their fate hangs on this, then every person should have sufficient evidence for it. And so, and that creates this other layer of a problem. Okay, so now this is carrying us into the territory. It's carrying us into the territory of, theology and the underlying worldview, because obviously there's a presupposition here, right? I've already touched on the fact that the argument, as formulated by Schellenberg, tends to conflate like belief and faith, and it tends to have a broadly Protestant sort of evangelical picture of salvation and damnation and all the rest of this. So let's get into this sort of layer of objection, because this is carrying us into the overall narrative, right? Because the narrative that's here is suggesting that people are sort of cast about in the world, and they all have sort of different degrees of access to God, and some people are damned based on sort of a lack of access to God, which is pretty big premise. So let's start to dig into the actual worldview side of things. So one objection or one response that I've heard to this before is that, it suggests, well, this too has the same underlying presupposition, right? The idea that somehow if sufficient evidence were given that the person would believe, okay, fair, I understand, that's the case, but I don't think there's any doubting the fact that there actually are people who have, a lesser access to God. I don't think there is any denying that some people have lesser analytic capabilities. I don't think there's any denying the sort of disproportionality that is identified in the objection. And also here, I want to validate the fact that this is an objection. This is ultimately an objection from justice, right? The idea that suggests if a person is going to be held accountable for their response to God, then it's important that they have knowledge and culpability. So if anybody has heard me talk about free will, and again, you can go to the free will episode, one of the things that I talk about is how the church fathers, especially, talk about the fact that moral culpability, moral responsibility requires two things: knowledge of what you ought to do or ought not to do, and the ability to do or not do it. And everybody comes into the world knowing that. We all intuitively know it. It's why kids, as soon as they're caught, doing something wrong, their first, their first line of defense is hopefully lie and, obscure reality. Second line of defense, if they're caught red-handed, is to say either I didn't know, right, claim ignorance, or I did know, so I can't say that. I couldn't help it, right? There's some sort of mitigating condition where I was coerced into it, right? And that's reflective of the fact that we recognize that that if we know what we ought to do and we have the ability to do or not do it, then we're culpable for doing it. And that's something that's true with kids. They're never taught that, just sort of intuitively know that. And then as adults, that's every defense, right? Every legal defense, every moral defense, that's what we do. And so this argument is basically an argument that's suggesting that not everybody has an equal, sort of knowledge of what they ought to do or capacity to do or not do it, hypothetically due to, well, in some cases due to diminished access to knowledge, in some cases due to diminished capacities and things like that. And so I want to validate that argument and say, like, look, that's a fair point and a fair objection. And so one of the things that's being raised here is how come God does not, is this some sort of favoritism? Okay. And here I'm going to, I'd like to make, sort of 2 points related to this. And the one is something that Leibniz points out. And so those of you who know, I have an upcoming book on Leibniz and the Problem of Evil coming out from Routledge this year. And that's one of the reasons I'm also planning on doing a whole series on the Problem of Evil. But with Leibniz, one of the things that you actually see, Leibniz points this out, and he's very sensitive to this fact. And he's not of the mind that we can just say, like, well, everybody deserves to be damned, and so God has no obligations, people and things like that. He's sensitive to this sort of justness, right? The potential injustice that's being identified here. And this is where Leibniz wants to insist. First of all, he makes certain appeals to the idea that people are judged according to the knowledge that they have, which is actually a very traditional Christian position. He makes appeals to certain Jesuit missionaries and things like that. But, basically, you can find this pretty consistently across the church fathers, the idea that God judges us proportionate to the knowledge that we have. And this is one of the reasons why there's a certain optimism regarding pagans who were responsive to the Logos, right, who recognized God in the world, even though they didn't know about the incarnation or things like that. So there's always been this sort of Christian tradition about proportionality. That's one of the things there too. As for why God doesn't just solve it, Leibniz makes a really interesting point, which he suggests that God's duties and his obligations are to the whole of the world. And by the whole, Leibniz doesn't mean, regardless of the individual. What he means is to every individual thing. And so it's an interesting case that he makes, because what he suggests is that if God were to pursue, let's say, one creature who is lost, right, the one lost sheep, he's going to pursue the one lost sheep until that sheep is saved, right? And he's going to make all of his providential choices about the world just to save that one being. He might actually be engaged in injustice, where he's neglecting the rest of creation. And so we might think about it this way, right? Let's pretend you're in a family. You have multiple kids, and there's one kid that has really serious problems, right? Drug problems, or maybe they have mental problems, a mental disorder or something like that. It would be entirely possible to neglect all the other kids in order to just focus on that one kid, right? Because this one kid you're so concerned with, that it consumes like that focal point, the correcting of that sort of toxicity, whatever it is, ends up consuming all of the energy of the entire family. And that would actually be unjust, right? It would be unjust because you actually do have duties to the other kids in the family. It's interesting. I think it was Dennis Prager who I once heard. He was talking about sort of troubled kids, and he talked about this phrase that says, you can't be happier. Dennis is a big advocate of the idea that you actually have choices to make about your own happiness. Okay. And so he suggests that he talks about the phrase that a parent can never be any happier than their least happy kid. And Prager attacked that and basically said, he thinks you have a duty to actually, be happy because you have other things, right? There are other people in the world than just that troubled kid. Now, he's not suggesting you neglect the troubled kid, but he's suggesting that it would be unjust, right? That you sort of let all of life spiral around this one sort of troubled person, because there are other people who you have other duties to. And so you actually have a duty to, while tending to that one troubled kid, to also provide what's needed for the other kids in the family. And this is basically the case that Leibniz makes. He admits that, like, yes, humanity is more valuable to God than, a lion, right? Higher in the chain of being. He's using great chain of being reasoning here. And he says, but that doesn't mean that God would destroy all of mankind in order to, save one human being. And that's because Leibniz is getting to the point of saying, like, look, God has duties to everything in the cosmos. Now, to the question of saying, well, so then does God disregard the creature? And this is where Leibniz actually argues. No, he suggests that God still does for each individual do whatever is necessary, such that it's possible, right, that he has given to each creature what is necessary in order for that creature to attain, salvation and happiness. Now, that doesn't mean that every creature will, right? Because it's reciprocal. There's free will. But there's definitely enough given by God so that every creature might be saved. Whether every creature is saved falls to free will. Now, this gets into certain worldview stuff, specifically when you're like, well, are people saved? Are people damned? Again, not going to do a whole episode here on universal salvation. But that's a spicy hot topic. I have a letter that I wrote in my Substack, right? My theological letters. We'll link to that too, where I talk about my views on this. This is sometimes referred to as apokatastasis. I've critiqued the use of this term. Apokatastasis just means cycles. It's not a term that in itself necessarily means universal salvation. And I talk about the reasons why I think that's a sort of a misguided term to use when talking about universal salvation. In other words, I argue that, all forms of apokatastasis are universal salvation, but not all universal salvation is apokatastasis. I won't belabor that. That's getting sort of into the weeds here. But the point is this. I've laid bare my case where I don't think that universal salvation, the hope of universal salvation, is inherently heretical. Okay, and you can see my letter on why I suggest that it's the case. However, I grant that the majority report of the Eastern Church Fathers, Church Fathers in general, but the Eastern Church Fathers, is that most of them are pessimistic, that all will be saved, but some of them actually do believe that all will be saved. And so I think it sits in this place of saying, well, it is entirely possible that maybe, just maybe, all will be saved. God will successfully save all before the final judgment. And I don't think holding out that hope is heretical. In fact, I think every Christian should hold out that hope. And if you don't hope for that, then there's something that's gone spiritually wrong. So I'll just say that. And so that's where I look at this and I say, well, there's a problematic sort of presumption, right? There's a presumption here that some will be damned. So that would at the very least need to be put in the conditional. But the other thing that I'll say here is this, that even where the church fathers, the Eastern Church Fathers, and this would be, okay, man, I'm plugging a lot of stuff here, but these are the best shortcuts I have. I did another theological letters on Christ's descent into Hades. And one of the things that you see there is you see that according to the Eastern Church Fathers, Christ successfully redeems all of humanity, meaning he takes on, the incarnation. If we're talking here about the Christian worldview, right, the Eastern Christian worldview, what you begin to see is that Christ takes on all of humanity, right? He takes on humanity, right, our human nature, which is something that I have and you have. And so in becoming incarnate, he takes on our nature. He's united to us in that way. And he does that in order to redeem that nature. And in the redeeming of that nature, he also descends into Hades and looses the bonds of death on all of humanity, right? And so this is one of the reasons why you see very verbose language in like Chrysostom's Paschal homily, his Easter homily, where he talks about all have been raised, right? All have been loosed from the dead. Nobody's left in the grave. Now, of course, this is where you get into the sort of dicey part of saying, well, how do you square that language with the possibility that some might be damned? And the answer is that even though the way has been opened up for all, nobody is left in Hades. People have to come out, right? This is actually a process, right, by which we have to enter into that life that's been offered to us. And so this is where one of the analogies that I've used is, people are familiar with C.S. Lewis's phrase, hell is locked from the inside. And I suggest, putting aside the conflation of hell and Hades, I'd say that like the picture of Hades it's too strong to say that Hades is locked from the inside, right? The realm of the dead is locked from the inside, because the picture in the Eastern Church Fathers is that Christ has ripped off the doors. There are no doors, right? So the idea being that all of humanity has been loosed, right? So if anybody's still in Hades, they're sitting in a prison without gates, right? They're sitting in a prison that's been flooded with the light of God and that they've been called to come out of, but they're trying to find some shadow to hide in. And so they have been freed, right? But they still need to exit. And that's sort of that balancing act there. So amongst the Eastern Church Fathers, one of the things that I argue is I point out that it's ubiquitous amongst the Eastern Church Fathers that all of humanity has been liberated from death. The question is, will all come out of the prison, right? Or do we choose to stay there, right? Do we choose to like walk out, or do we not? Because that's the important part. And this is where that really gets into this question of faith and maturity and the sort of spiritual moving into and embracing of that. But I will say this, within Eastern Christianity, there is a broader story being told, right? It's not so simple as the sort of evangelical picture of suggesting that I am born into the world and I hear about Jesus, and if I believe in Jesus, my sins are forgiven, and then I go to heaven. If I hear about Jesus and I reject Jesus, then I go to hell, and it's as simple as that, right? There's a more dynamic or organic process to the picture of redemption. And so for this, in order to really sort of grasp what this picture is, I think we need to go into the last thing that I want to talk about here in this episode, which is the fact that the blindness, the hiddenness of God that we experience really is unnatural. And so I had said this, right? I had said that one of the things that I think is problematic about the way sometimes this problem is dealt with is that people will talk about divine hiddenness as if it's natural. They'll talk about the pain of God's seeming absence as something that is just sort of like natural, and it's there for, you're good as a child who has to grow up. And I think that misses the fact that there is something wildly unnatural about the type of divine hiddenness that we currently experience. And so here I'm going to speak from an Eastern patristic, Eastern Orthodox picture about the world. The idea is when you look at sort of the world as it is meant to be, within the Eastern Church Fathers, one of the things that you see is that all of creation is made to partake and participate in God. And I talk about this at length in that episode, Man's Place in the Cosmos. But the idea is that, especially, let's start with God and rational creatures, icons of God, the angels, you and me. In order to grasp this, I think the first thing we need to understand is the distinction between God's essence and his energies. Not going to belabor that. We've got a whole episode on it. But the basic distinction is this, that there's a difference between the nature of thing and the articulations of that thing. For example, I have a mind. The nature of mind is one thing. How that expresses itself, the energies, right, the operative powers that express it are my speaking, my reasoning, things like that. And those are the things that go forth from me that you encounter. Now, one of the concepts that sort of started to emerge over time as this distinction was developed, first in Aristotle and Alexandrian Judaism, then the New Testament, then the Eastern Church Fathers, was the idea that some of these operative powers are communicable, right? So one of the favorite analogies used by the Eastern Church Fathers for this is the idea of iron and fire. The idea that how the nature of fire expresses itself is through heating and lighting. And if you stick iron in it, it's receptive to it. At some point, it begins to glow and burn, and you can remove it. And now, even though the iron is still iron, it has the operative powers of fire, heating and lighting. And this was how they understood the communication of spiritual realities, right? The idea that somehow the spiritual energies are communicable. This is how they understood demoniacs, right? They are being energized by a foreign nature, namely a demonic power. This is how they understood prophets, who are being energized by God. They're participating in divine power and energy. They're essentially conduits, right? They are still human, right? But they are participating in a foreign operative power from a foreign nature. And this wasn't seen as an exception to the nature of reality. This was seen as the proper order of reality. In other words, the order of nature is such that there is a hierarchy, right? You have God, and then you have this hierarchy of angels, these extremely godlike things, pure spirits. And then that intersects with the organic world at the hinge point of man, right? Where man is this hybrid of the organic world with a rational spirit, an icon of God. And then you descend down into the irrational things of the order of nature. And part of the question is like, well, why is this the case? And I talk about that in Man's Place in the Cosmos in that episode. But the idea is that God's desire is that all things participate in him as much as possible. And so this reciprocity, right, this ability to participate in the divine energies is something that is clearly true in the images of God and things that are rational. We have the capacity to, mirror God's justice, his love, his mercy, his goodness, and things like that, as well as, apparently, to channel other sorts of powers, like to be a healing influence, and this is where you start to see like miracles and things like that, and also the promise of immortality that's ultimately made through Christ. And the idea is that the proper order of nature is such that the divine energies, right, that the hierarchy of angel participates in God, and is energized by God. That's why they're holy and they're good and they obey his will and they embrace the good and they're just and they're merciful and loving. And so it is with man. And then because man is this hinge point connected with the organic realm, that channels all the way through man into the lower things of nature. Now, they can't participate in God to the same degree that you and I can because they're not icons of God, but they can participate in it to an extent. And this is where you start to see relics and holy places and all the sorts of places where, in the Bible, for example, where divine energy is channeled through a person to a thing, right? Christ's garments, handkerchiefs from the apostles, the Ark of the Covenant, right? Things like this, right? All those, that's where you get those sorts of concepts. And the idea is that the proper order of nature, if we envision the world where the fall never happens, it's never been corrupted, what you see is a world where divine life and light is cascading down from God through the order of angels into man and from man to the rest of the created order. And what you see in somebody like, let's say, Moses, when he goes up to Sinai, that sort of thing that struck people as so weird, right? Like they're really unnerved. Your face is glowing, man. Like that's not right. And he has to put a veil on. That's actually the proper order of nature. When you see the transfiguration and you see Christ's flesh transfigured, right? That's the proper order of nature. When you see the resurrection and Christ's body has been raised and transfigured and made incorruptible, that's the proper order of nature. And so the picture is that had all of creatures actually grown up and become spiritually mature the way we're supposed to, that would be the whole cosmos. But what happens in the fall is we actually quite literally shut off those valves to the world. What happens in the world is when we turn away from God and we refuse to be those conduits, all of a sudden there's a choking of what's supposed to be the case. And the reason I think this is particularly relevant to the problem of divine hiddenness is because what that means is it means a couple of things. First of all, one of the things you see come through in the church fathers is the idea that the soul is blinded. We are supposed to actually see God, right? The way Adam and Eve were capable of seeing God, right? And yet we blinded the eye of the soul. And so in this sense, the fact that God is everywhere present and filling all things, but we don't see him is actually an indication of our own blindness. On this narrative, essentially what we are is we're blind people filled in a world with light. And we go around going, how come there's no light? And the answer is there is. It's just that you're blind to it. So that's one thing. The other thing is that when we look at the world, one of the problems is that the conduits that are supposed to be the things that refract the light of God and make God evident have refused to do that, right? They've shut off that valve. So if you and I were looking at Moses having come down from the mountain and his face is glowing, we wouldn't be like, wow, that's really cool, but where's God? We would know, right? In a very palpable way, the glory of God is somehow radiating through Moses. It's refracting. And when you look at this, what you see is that God is not supposed to be hidden, that the beings that are supposed to grow up and mature are supposed to grow up and mature in a way where they begin to refract or radiate the divine light, such that when you see them, you see God. You see God in all of the conduits all around him. And yet, what we've done is we've shut off God in terms of the world, right? The fall has in some ways cut off the lower things of creation. That's why it groans, right? That's what I talk about in that episode. The demons have shut off the light of God and the life of God when they turn away from him, and now they corrupt and harm us, right? And then we too, oftentimes, like I point this out with the problem of evil, oftentimes when we're like, where is God? How come God doesn't show up? Oftentimes the answer is in the mirror, right? The reason things have gone wrong is sometimes us, right? The reason nobody's showing up to help the other person is because we're refusing to show up and help the other person. And so I think this is a really important thing to realize, because while I think it's true, all the things are true about love and the conditions of love. I think it's true that all the things are true there when we're talking about spiritual maturity and the sorts of conditions that are necessary for us to grow up into that. I think all of that's true. But I think one of the things that's oftentimes missed is how unnatural the current state of affairs is. Because the natural state of affairs, the way it's been designed, what's supposed to be, is that God is everywhere present, filling all things. And the eyes of our soul are open to see it. And the conduits of God, the mirrors of God, right? The images of God properly refract him so that we can see him everywhere, everywhere present and filling all things. And that's one of the things that we've cut off. And so for that reason, then we have to enter into the question of the narrative of what do we do? And that goes to the entire discussion of the gospel and what Christ has done for humanity and what we're supposed to do in response. Now, I'm not going to talk about that here, but I do talk about it in other episodes, like Man's Place in the Cosmos. So I'll leave it there. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.